Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. ರೈತ ಮಜ್ಲಿಹುಗೆ ಎನ್ವೈರನ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಕ್ಲೈಮೇಟ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಕಮಿಟಿಗೆ ಮೀಹಾರುಗೆ ದೇವಣ ಬದ್ದಲುಮ ಕಮಿಟಿಗೆ ಜೆತ್ತರಿ ಮೆಂಬರುನ್ನ ಹೊರಬಡ ಮರಹಬಾದಣ್ಣವಂಗ್ ಅದೇಗಿತರು ಮೀ ಕಮಿಟಿ ಅಡ್ವೆಸ್ಸಮ ವಡಾನ್ ತಿಬ್ಬೆವಿ ಎಹೆಂಗ್ ಇಜ್ಜೆತ್ತರಿ ಮೆಂಬರುನ್ನ ವೆಸ್ ಹೊರಬಡ ಶುಕುರ್ದಣ್ಣವಂಗ್ ಮಿಯದುಗೆ ಮೀ ಬದ್ದಲುಮಕಿ ಅಮಿಗೆ ದೆದುವೆ ಕೂರಿಂಗ್ ಕಮಿಟಿಗೆ ಬದ್ದಲುಮೆ ಬಾವ್ಯಾಗೆಂಗ್ ಅಳ್ಗೊಂಡ್ಮೆಂಗ್ ಮಿಯದುಗೆ ಮೀ ಬದ್ದಲುಮಂಗ್ ಬೇವುಮ ಫಾಸ್ಕೊಗ್ಗೆಂಗ್ ಕುರಿಯಗೆಂದ ಬದ್ದಲುಮೆಕ್ಕಂಗ್ ಮಾಲೂಮಾತಟಕ ದಣ್ಣವಾಲ ಮಿಯದುಗೆ ಬದ್ದಲುಮಗೆ ಎಜೆಂಡಾಗ ಮಿಯತಿ ಅಳ್ಗೊಂಡುಗೆ ತಾರಫೆ ದೆಂಗ್ ಎಗ್ ಫಹುಂ ರೈತ ಮಜ್ಲಿಗೆ ಜೆತೆ ರೈಸ್ ವಾಕ್ಫುಲ್ ದಕ್ಕವಾಣೆ ಎಗ್ ಫಹುಂ ಮಿಯದುಗೆ ಮಿ ಬದ್ದಲುಮಗೆ ಎಮ್ಮೆ ಹಾಸೆಂಗ್ ಐಟಮ್ ಐ Global Center on Adaptation ge Chief Executive Officer adi Jamia ge founder wahak for dakkawad algonda hiyani baddalmuga gotum by far ingres bohmes by wahak ta dannawalan jehene he good morning everyone, very pleased to have this sitting in the presence of Mr. Speaker President Nasheed and Dr. Patrick Verkooijen. I hope I got it right, who is the founder and CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, in brief GCA. This is an international organization based in the Netherlands, and the organization is well known for its successful work on climate adaptation for a climate resilient world. In particular, GCA focuses on those who are the most vulnerable like ours and the most poor people. I'm not going to go into the details. This is a very, very special session for us, and therefore the committee decided to proceed the conduct of this meeting in a little bit special way. Soon after my introduction, I would invite the speaker, President Nasheed, to say a few words, after which I would invite Dr. Patrick Verkooijen, CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, who is our special guest for this morning, to make a statement. Mr. Speaker, you have the floor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, and shukriya. It's a great pleasure, Dr. Patrick Verkooijen. It's a great pleasure and a delight to welcome you to the People's Majlis, our parliament. Since 2012, Dr. Patrick was the World Bank's, the group's special representative for climate change. In Paris at COP21, he shaped the carbon pricing leadership coalition headed by Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau. Dr. Patrick developed and managed an $800 million global investment program in forests. Since 2018, together with the head of the IMF, Bill Gates, and former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he spearheaded the Global Commission on Adaptation, which made the economic case for investment in climate adaptation. As the founding CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, he is at the helm of the first international organization for adaptation to climate change, and it is based in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Its headquarters is the largest floating office in the world, with programs and offices across the world. Dr. Patrick holds advanced degrees from Harvard University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where he is the professor in Sustainable Development Diplomacy, and he is widely published commentator on climate adaptation issues in major world publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Newsweek, and many, many others. But most importantly, Dr. Patrick is a bold global advocate and driver of international action on climate change. Recently, He launched the world's largest adaptation program in Africa. You will also remember in Glasgow last November, Dr. Patrick and the Environment Minister signed a memorandum of understanding of $200 million of projects in the Maldives. I would like to request Dr. Patrick to address the gathering. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Honorable members, honorable ministers, presidential envoy, but particularly Mr. Speaker, President Nasheed. What a source of inspiration you are for the world. In 2009, you awoke society from a slumber, a planet sleepwalking into climate catastrophe. Your underwater cabinet, your meeting captured the world's attention and its imagination, and even more importantly, it prompted us all to consider and start to confront a planetary crisis. My name indeed is Patrick Verkooijen. I am the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, or in shorthand GCA. We are the only international organization exclusively focused on adaptation measures. And what I said to President Nasheed and what I said to Minister Shauna, if an organization as ours cannot support a country like the Maldives, the board of the GCA either should fire me or should just complete the GCA into existence. We are fully behind your government and the people of the Maldives. And I'm very honored and quite frankly humbled, Mr. Speaker, to give the opportunity to address this very esteemed Parliament, because the Maldives is the embodiment of the front line of the climate emergency. But you, as you know, you're much more than that. The impact of our changing climate has also forced you to confront this crisis much earlier than the rest of the world and in a concerted manner. After all, 2/3 of your almost 1,200 islands suffer chronic erosion from rising seas. And Mr. Speaker and parliamentarians and ministers and presidential envoy, you are an inspiration for the world. Why? Because you have fought back by being bold and successful in forging solutions. This is not my first visit to an atoll nation, but this is my first and hopefully not last visit to the Maldives. And Mr. Speaker, I was very grateful that yesterday, thanks to Minister Shauna, I was able to visit the major new developments of phase 1 and 2 just over the bridge at Ulamale. And you may not think of it in that particular way, but Ulamale is a climate adaptation project. Why? Because it will home, as you know, almost 200,000 people, close to half your current population, safe from sea level rise and water supply projected. And I think, as a single project, it's quite possibly the largest and biggest and boldest climate adaptation effort in the world. It took the Netherlands, where I'm from, with all its civil engineers and all our resources, centuries to put in place the infrastructure that allows about 1/3 of our country to exist below sea level. Here in the Maldives, as we noted yesterday under the leadership of the minister, You have reclaimed phase 2 of Umalala in a matter of weeks. Yet, we all know this is clearly not enough. And I assume this is also not your vision for the future of this nation as a whole. For one, you may reclaim more islands as safe havens, but you could ultimately lose everything of the islands which are not protected. Island building may work in some cases, but ultimately this is not a global solution. And Mr. Speaker, it might even surprise you, but for a brief period in 1993, I myself was also a climate-displaced person. In that year, Europe was hit by severe floods, and my own hometown was completely flooded and evacuated. And I remember very vividly my belated father, God bless him, was sitting on the roof of the house protecting our belongings. So climate change is not new to the rest of the world as well, but it's so much more acute as it is here. We survived in 93, and since then the Netherlands has put in a lot of effort in so-called nature-based solutions to complement the shortcomings of our water infrastructure. And as you may have seen in the news, last summer, the floods returned to Europe in a dramatic fashion. With the same magnitude, we were hit in the Netherlands. We as the Netherlands, we managed relatively well to reduce its impact. But in Germany, our neighboring country, just upstream from us, there was a level of destruction which we have never experienced before. And what we take home from this, Mr. Speaker, one, which is my central message in humble presence, which I would like to share with you today. We are all Maldivians. We're all Maldivians in this climate fight. We are all vulnerable today, everywhere. In the Netherlands, in the Maldives, in Dhaka, in Miami, in Antarctica, in Alaska. But this also means that failing the Maldives means failing us all. We're all Maldivians since by not defending your nation and your people from climate devastation, we only prove that we will be incapable of defending the planet as a whole. And two, Mr. Speaker, my second message to you in humbleness is to overcome the power of nature we have unleashed by wrecking the planet. We should be returning back to nature and harnessing its power to persevere. Nature-based solutions that I discussed this morning with Minister Shauna, here in the Maldives, mangroves, reefs, for example, should be central to get the job done. Also, yesterday I was actually privileged to visit one of your reefs in South Mali. And quite frankly, this is quite personal because I was deeply saddened to, in essence, find an underwater coral graveyard. But obviously I wasn't surprised because this has become the hallmark of the global devastation of reefs happening in every ocean across the globe. And obviously I'm very aware of the solutions you have started to put forward to pioneer on coral reefs locally. But what it requires is scale. What it requires is speed. So back to the Netherlands, again, where I'm from, a tiny country in Western Europe. It is midwinter right now. And I, for one, I'm really feeling the heat in a particular way. And I'm certain you have all been feeling the heat because the IPCC confirmed just a few months ago that the world will warm to 1.5 degrees by 2030. That is 8 years from now. And this is a decade earlier than the IPCC predicted, not that recent. And back to South Asia, this massive increase in heat has been shown by the ILO to have an especially heavy toll on workers across South Asia. And if you're not already having your houses, your offices insulated like we do in the Netherlands against the cold, that will have to change, and that will have to change soon, because the heat is coming for you, and it will be nothing like what you have experienced in the past. And it's not only the air that warms, as you know, the oceans are also heating up, and that's why the 90% of all coral reefs are predicted to be dead in 2030. Fisheries, one of your traditional sectors, will also be heavily affected. And Maldives, your country, your people, will risk losing its edge as a tourist destination for many. So, Mr. Speaker, we're all living inside the eye of the storm. You, Mr. Speaker, President Nasheed, you know very well the leadership that is required to avert climate catastrophe. You yourself, after all, are the founding president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the CVF. You are its lead envoy on ambition, and your group clearly emerged at COP26 together with the presidential envoy. Thanks very much to your leadership and to Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's leadership as the leading global voice for action in the UN climate negotiations. It is, above all, the CVF put the 1.5 degree target into the Paris Agreement. I have my delegation here with me today. Some of them are senior members of the CVF Secretariat, of which we are the managing partner, and they're at your disposal to drive certain actions forward in the coming days and months ahead. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, Speaker Nasheed, you were the brainchild of the CVF prosperity plans. These are strategies, in essence, that aim to deliver climate action while boosting economic growth, jobs, and health. Because it's a very important realization. Investing in climate, it's good for the planet, obviously, but it's also good for our economy, and it's good for our health. And in your updated NDC, under the leadership of your president, President Stolle, the Maldives, you have committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. And in this very parliament, the world has been watching, has been following this closely. You have passed the Climate Emergency Act, which was a historical moment in global diplomacy and action around climate change. Mr. Speaker, the Maldives cannot save the planet from itself if others fail to follow your act. And my view is that global leadership, it has been strengthening, but at the same time, global emissions are still rising. And even if, or particularly as we now raise from the ashes of the COVID crisis, the emissions are rising again. And that has to stop. So the world needs your leadership, Mr. Speaker, from you and from this House, to be shown by other parliaments across the globe. That will be vital to keeping the Maldives safe. Unfortunately, we have a specific vehicle for that. A number of you, I know, have been very actively involved in the launch of the so-called CVF Parliament's platform, in where you will bring parliamentarians across the globe around this agenda. And we have within the GCA, we have a specific unit driving and supporting that particular platform, your platform. And I've discussed it with President Nasheed, with you, Mr. Speaker, that we will assign a specific international expert supporting your parliament in that particular effort. Because let us be very, very clear. Action in Maldives and action around the globe, it's a mundane thing, it's not a trivial thing. It requires finance. We can talk about action, and we talked about action this morning. We talked about access to finance. We need finance. The millions to unlock the billions to shift the trillions. Money is a must. And in 2009, Mr. Speaker, President Nasheed, when you came to Copenhagen, the world agreed to $100 billion flowing from north to south every single year. And the world has failed to deliver that promise. It has failed the Maldives, and it has failed itself. And its repercussions are far more widespread and devastating than we expected before. Independent information, and which you also confirmed, Mr. President, that your government is already spending 50% of its national budget on climate adaptation. So climate adaptation is already your #1 public expenditure. And to bring this into context, after the 2008 global financial crisis, the US alone, the US Congress alone, approved $700 billion in single bailouts to its industry of big banks and lenders. And now trillions are unlocked to rise from the COVID crisis in G20 country. But yet nothing is more corrosive to the world economy than climate change. So my proposition to you as Parliament is that the only real solution on finance is to think big and to think at scale. For that, I argue, we should first look at the trillions of debt currently owed by poor, debt-distressed, climate-vulnerable nations to rich ones. If we were to restructure all or much of this debt by allowing servicing payments to be reinvested in climate adaptation, it would be good for the economy. It would be good for countries such as the Maldives, but it also would be good for the investors. And this could immediately free up much more than the $100 billion a year for nature-based and resilient investments, and creditors would be much more satisfied with better safeguards. So the Global Center on Adaptation, with our offices in Europe, in Africa, in South Asia, and in China, and around the world, quite frankly, we are pleased to play that role of solutions broker. It's solutions and it's brokering to facilitate cooperation, including on financing. And I want to highlight one specific initiative, and President Nasheed, you already referenced it. Last year, in close collaboration with the African Union and the African Development Bank president, we launched, designed, put on the table the largest adaptation program to date, Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. $25 billion over 5 years, 12.5 is already mobilized in one single year. Why can we not have a AAAP, as it is called, equivalent for either South Asia or for the SIDS or for both? That's the level of scale which is required, which I also would like to put into a motion for your Parliament to consider. So in the first year of the AAAP, i.e. last year, we as GCA, as a relatively new organization, we already influenced over $1 billion of investment. $1 billion of investment. In what? Climate-smart agriculture, nature-based solution for infrastructure, access to finance, youth entrepreneurs, jobs. So if we can do it in Africa, we should do it in South Asia with the Maldives at its anchor. Because small islands, they desperately need, as you keep telling us, and we hear you loud and clear, you need funding for programs of your own. Mr. Speaker, your underwater cabinet. And I heard a little bit of the backdrop story from Minister Shauna yesterday. You had to be trained to dive and how to go underwater. And there was a whole choreography behind it, of course. But what it did, it shone a light on the crisis which we face. So when we replicate the AAAP program to South Asia, we are embarking on the solutions which you require. And there's another part of the motion I want to put forward for your consideration. To think big, as you do, given you adopted the Climate Emergency Act. I also think we need, and that's Mr. Speaker, my second part of the motion, we need more moves, like from the IMF, which is happening as we speak, channeling its financing $650 billion of special drawing rights is currently under negotiation in Washington and DC into a resilience and sustainability trust. Kristalina Georgieva, who is in the board of the GCA, is very much focused to make these resources work for countries such as yours. But I think it's very important that your parliament, your government, is heavily engaged in the negotiations on the structure of these resources. Thirdly, the V20, the finance ministers group of the CVF, we have the global lead, Sarah, here with us. It proposed guarantee schemes which could leverage $15 of climate adaptation benefits for every dollar invested in public funds. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, honorable members, honorable minister, presidential envoy, what I hope you will see the GCA as your partner of choice. What I hope is that we could develop from the beginning a very robust, mature partnership. Yes, we signed an MOU. But it's one thing to sign an MOU, it's something else to develop a work program, and it's something else to operationalize projects coming to the ground. And what I hope that you as Parliament and as government will hold us accountable to deliver. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's our reason why we're here. Because for what is important and what happens here in Maldives is relevant for the Maldives, obviously, but it's also relevant for the world. Because by joining forces under your leadership, Mr. Speaker, under the leadership of your President, we can safeguard, I'm strongly convinced of that, the future of the Maldives. I'm very positive and determined we can secure a safe and prosperous future for this great island nation. So I very much look forward to working with all of you. And in closing, I want to come back to my opening point. We are all Maldivians after all. We have to come together with your parliament, with your government, with other governments, with finance ministries, with CEOs, with cities, with institutional investors, because only together we can prevail against an existential threat like climate crisis. I thank you very much indeed. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick, for that inspiring and forward-looking speech. And before I conclude, I'd like to highlight a few points. Yes, of course, there is no doubt that the Maldives badly needs funding, in particular for its adaptation works. As you would know, 80% of our country is just 1 meter above the mean sea level, and 44% of residential area and 47% of all our infrastructure lies within 100 meters from the coastline. Yet, you would know our contribution to global climate change crisis is very, very limited. According to statistics, we emit something like 1,536.04 gigagrams of CO2 equivalent, which is, according to statistics again, just 0.0035% of the global emission, which is insignificant. We are doing everything that we can as a nation to combat the impacts of climate change. The 19th Majlis established the first ever Standing Committee on Environment and Climate Change. We are making every single effort to close the gap between policy and legislation. Pre-2019, we observed volatile environmental policy changes due to lack of enabling legal framework for climate policies. 19th Majlis coordinates very closely with the government on climate policies through enactment of enabling legislation towards adaptation and mitigation. I'd like to note the Climate Emergency Act you highlighted in your speech as well, which is adopted in 2021. The legislative framework sets the net zero target of 2030. It sets a monitoring, reporting, and a verification system for the country, climate change directorate, climate change fund, special envoy appointment, and many other important elements as well. But despite the adoption of a strong legal framework, we face several challenges. As you would know, increased intensity and frequency and predictability of extreme weather events continue. Average elevation of Maldives is just 1 meter above the mean sea level, while observed rate of sea level rise is 3.9 millimeters per year. Addressing loss and damage from climate impact is diverting our resources away from broader development and mitigation ambition. You would very clearly understand the impact on budgetary resources. Because of COVID-19 pandemic, the world clearly saw the vulnerability of Maldives. In addition to a public health crisis, our economy shrunk by 33.5% in 2021. The approved budget for 2022 was 36.9 billion. Of this, 4.2% allocated for environmental protection or adaptation in particular. And a significant portion of our annual budget, which is something like 32.8%, goes to debt servicing and repayment. And I think I should also note that total public and publicly guaranteed debt as a percentage of GDP now stands at 124%. Now, this is very worrying. Why is it worrying? Because look at the estimated cost of coastal protection in all inhabited islands. According to some estimates, it comes to $8.8 billion US. And if you go to a bank and if you look at these figures, these are not bankable projects. You would understand very clearly. And I also would like to highlight the complex procedures by donor agencies in providing funds for adaptation works. They would attach preconditions and ask us to provide scientific evidence of climate change impacts at very local levels. That is the main issue. And this makes inherently very complex in developing proposals for the banks. They would ask us to demonstrate the bankability and return on investments for coastal development projects. Something very, very wrong. If you want to get funds approved for a shore protection works from a bank, it would take at least 10 to 15 years. So these challenges makes things very, very difficult for us. As a result, our adaptation plans remains largely unfunded. The government of Maldives, under the leadership of His Excellency President Ibrahim Mohammed Saleh, is working very hard to address the funding gap to fulfill both global commitments and urgent adaptation works for the islands. There is no inhabited island that is not experiencing abnormal coastal erosion. I applaud the work of the President and our Environment Minister, whose work is noteworthy, but I must say that clear policies and bold targets are not enough to address the issue. We need funding. We badly need funding. I note with gratitude the hard work you are doing to mobilize $200 million through climate adaptation projects for the people of the Maldives through an MOU that was signed during the last COP. Dr. Patrick, I know with your decades of diplomatic experience, working in multilateral institutions and working closely with world leaders, you are in an excellent position to help the Maldives to mobilize the much needed resources. The idea of accelerated adaptation funding program for SIDS is very, very welcoming. We, the members of the parliament, assure you that we will do what it takes to make it happen. We've listened to your proposal very carefully. I will take your proposal to the committee. We will deliberate on it, and we will report back to the plenary. And you will get to know the outcome through Mr. Speaker very soon. And I would not hesitate to say the outcome would be very positive. Thank you once again, members of the Climate Change Committee, other members who took time to attend this important session. Thank you, ministers, and thank you everyone for attending this very special session. With these few words, I would like to conclude today's sitting. Thank you.
I didn't know Sabra was around. Please come.